Okay, first we will discuss basic Cisco ISE terminologies. One of them is identity. What is identity? Identity means to prove yourself. When you try to log into network, okay, when endpoint, either user, either voice or IP phone, it can be through wireless, through a wire, it can be through VPN, whatever, when a device, either a user try to reach your network, they need to provide you some sort of identity, and that identity can be implies username and password, that can be endpoint MAC address, and it can be a certificate, whatever. It can be anything where they can prove themselves. So this is called identity. And let me show you, by the way, if I go to ISE, let me log into ISE. Okay, so you can, there is identity management. You see there is internal identities as well. It can be a username with password. So this is internal identity. So when that user try to log in, they need to put this username and password to prove. So this is his identity, either her identity. And it can be external identity. External identity can be a certificate. It can be Active Directory username and password in Active Directory. It can be LDAP. It can be RDS. It can be through SAML, whatever. There are many ways to prove. So it means, who the hell are you? You need to provide a user or a device detail. Suppose it can be a user, it's okay, username and password, and it can be an endpoint MAC address as well. You can add yourself here, MAC address of the device. So it is also sort of identity. So identity can be anything. And I show you some identities: a username and password, an endpoint detail, MAC address, certificate, etc. Now coming to next terminology is identity store. Identity store means database of identities, where these user and endpoint keep their details. Is called identity store. So identity is a store or a database that used to authenticate user and endpoint. It can be internal and it can be external identity store. Means you can connect external identity store as well to Cisco ISE. And if you go there, administration and identity management, there is external identity sources. It is a certificate, authentication profile, Active Directory, LDAP, OD, BC, RDS, RSS, SAML, and social login, and so many other ways you can connect external identities. And it can be internal identities as well, to create a username and password here, and also to create endpoint detail here. You can click plus and you can put the MAC address, and then you can type description, static assignment if you want to assign them to a specific, maybe workstation, whatever. Microsoft, if we have Microsoft window phone, it can be whatever Microsoft device, suppose, and you can put group as well, Microsoft whatever, and save. So this is endpoint detail internal, and this was identity of internal, and you can put external Active Directory or other as well. These identity store, we can use their attribute to authorize someone or device, a user, whatever. We use these in our authorization policies and authentication policies. If I go to policy and policy set, here you can put their detail in authentication as well. Look at internal endpoint. So if you already create internal endpoint detail, you can call them here in your authentication policies. And if I click here, there should be internal user, guest user, all user ID stores, certificate, my device, so many, and you can create as well. You can combine internal and external as well, because it's also possible, and which we will see. You can create identity source sequence to combine internal and external, like in this one. First check internal user, then all active directory, then guest user, and you can add internal endpoint as well, and then you can call them here. So what is the name? All user ID stores means all ID store. It can be internal, external, whatever combination you create. So here is all user ID store. So these ID stores are very important. So whenever you try to create your authentication policy and authorization policy, you can call them, and based on this identity store you can take action. So it can be internal and it can be external. External, I show you, it can be Active Directory, LDAP, OTP server, smart card, and certificate authority, and many more. And internal we already check out. You can create for endpoint, and you can create internal group, and you can create internal users with password as well. And I show you here, you can create your internal and you can connect external as well, where we will connect external as well later in the course. This is external. Some example of external identity sources, and you can combine them as well. Identity source sequence, which I show you. Now coming to local. So whenever you create username and password locally in Cisco ISE, we call them local. And whenever you create internal endpoint detail, we call them local. And when you connect external, we call them external. So internal user database can be used internal identity store for local authentication. So it means it's up to you. You can create user and user identity here and endpoint identities here, and then you can call them whatever in your authentication policies. Just click here, add, and then you can create, suppose if I say test1 and password is abc@12345 and abc@12345. Suppose this is my user, but password type is internal user. Okay, so this is internal user, and you can assign them to group as well. It means you can create internal group as well. So my user is ready, and now I can use them in my policies. And if you need groups, you can create internal groups as well. This is endpoint identity groups, and this is user identity groups. Some of them is already there. When you click add, you can create a group. Suppose you say internal group, and here is. And now you can use this internal group in your authentication policies. So whenever you create a user inside in Cisco ISE, we call them internal user. And whenever you create endpoint detail internally, we call them internal or local. So now we know what is local. Means when you create something locally, username and password and Cisco ISE, we call them local. And I show you we create one user here. When you go to administration, identity management, identities, user, here you can create local. Now another terminology is node. Node is nothing but a physical or virtual Cisco ISE appliance. So when you are running Cisco ISE software, that virtual either physical appliance is called node. So basically a node is individual instance that runs Cisco ISE software. So a virtual, either a physical appliance, when it's running Cisco ISE software, we call them node. Because we can run Cisco ISE virtually and we can run them in a physical box as well. So in shortcut, each instance appliance or a virtual VM that runs Cisco ISE software is called node. So you get the idea what is node. We call them node. Now another terminology is persona. So persona or personas. We just discussed node. A node is an appliance which runs Cisco ISE software. But that Cisco ISE software, which type of services they are providing, that is called persona. Basically there are 4 persona which we will discuss in next lecture. Cisco ISE can provide you 4 type of personas. One of them is administration persona, policy service persona, monitoring and troubleshooting persona, and PX grade controller persona. These 4 are the persona. So persona is nothing but the services which a Cisco ISE node can provide you. Which type of services ISE can provide? So maximum a Cisco ISE can provide you these 4 persona: administration, policy service, monitoring and troubleshooting, and PX grade controller. Policy service node, we call them PSN, which we will discuss in next lecture. Policy administration node, we call them PAN, and monitoring and troubleshooting, we call them MNT, and the other one is PX grade controller, either PX grade. So these 4 are the persona which a Cisco ISE node can provide you. So it basically, persona is the role that the Cisco ISE is filling. Which role they can play? There are 4 roles they can play. They can play all these 4 roles. If I go to my Cisco ISE administration deployment, and if I click on this one, look at my Cisco ISE node, they can provide me these 3 persona right now: administration, monitoring, and policy services, and as mentioned here. And also if you go to server information, so it's mentioned here that personas is administration, monitoring, policy services, that I can provide these 3 personas. And if I click on this one, I can click PX grid, suppose, that provide this, the maximum persona they can provide, one box. And if I click again deployment, this time there is PX grid as well, that I can provide administration, monitoring, policy service and PX grid, which we will discuss in detail. This is just a terminologies. And if I click again server information, so now that should be PX grid as well, administration, monitoring, policy service and PX grid personas. That this box can provide you all four personas, all four services. I would say services, and here for your understanding purpose I would say services, the services which they can fill the role, which role they can play. So there are maximum 4 role, and distributed deployment we distribute these personas. Like right now, because I am a standalone, so I am playing all 4 role. But if I make myself primary, now I can distribute beside administration, because another administration is not there. So I can say that I don't want to play role of monitoring, I don't want to play role of policy service node, and I don't want to play role of PX grid. Provide these 3 roles to someone else. So these 4 are personas. Which role I can play? Right now they say that I can only pay administration. And then when you click, you can, right now we don't have another device, you can assign this one as a secondary as well. Again, don't go and right now, just to tell you what is personas. Now inside every persona, they are providing some sort of services. Every persona is for special type of services. But for your understanding, just right now, that there are 4 type of persona, either personas which Cisco ISE can provide you, Cisco ISE node can provide you. And these 4 are these one. Now coming to another terminology is services. Now this one is related to personas. So services is a specific features that persona provide. Now this one is hopefully clear, this persona as well. So every persona provides specific features such as network access, profiling services, posture, security group access, monitoring and troubleshooting. So in the case of MNT, so MNT can provide you monitoring and troubleshooting services. So if you play role and persona of MNT, then you can get report, you can get logs, these and monitoring. So if you want to play role of monitoring persona, so monitoring persona can provide you, these are monitoring, radius logs, live session, TakeX live logs, adaptive network control list, logs, troubleshooting, diagnostic tool and report, and also these context visibility. These 2 tabs are nothing but monitoring. So if you want logs, report, monitoring, troubleshooting, then you need to play a role of MNT, and that role is called persona. And this is called services. Which services MNT can provide you? They can provide you monitoring and troubleshooting services. This is called services. Now PSN can provide you network access services, guest services, client provisioning services, radius services. If you need these sort of services, then you need to play a role of PSN. If I go back So then this is policy service node. If I enable that I want to play a role of policy services persona, then I can provide profiling services. Here as is mentioned under policy services. I can provide tagging services. I can provide admin services, device administration services, passive identity services. And all these policies you can see in this tab, under this tab, this is policy service node. Like profiling, client provisioning, posturing. Under this policy tab, all these things are called policy service node. So if you want RDS, guest services, profiling, client provisioning, then you need to play a role of PSN. Last one is administration node. Now administration node can provide you a services, administrative services, handling of policy services, system related configuration. All these things can be provided by administration node, and this is administration node. Like deployment, like certificates, like maintenance, like upgrade, like downgrade, like backup and restore, network devices. All these things can provide you administration tab and administration node. So this is called service, which services they are providing. So every persona provide different type of services. We call them services. So these 2 points are interrelated, persona and services. I hope you understand what is persona and what is services. Now coming to another terminology is role. Role is, there can be, Cisco ISE can play a standalone role, primary or secondary. That's it. These three are the only role they can play. How? A device can be primary. Here is role as primary. Right now I am a primary device. And if I say make standalone, now I am a standalone. I'm not helping any other one. And it can be a secondary. When you make primary, you can make another device secondary as well here. But that can be only for administration node and monitoring node. There is no concept of primary and secondary for policy service node. That's why this primary role is mentioned here, but here is no such thing. So keep in mind, there is no such thing. So it means this role can be a secondary, it can be a primary, and it can be a standalone device. Standalone. But this apply only to administration and monitoring node. Keep in mind, this primary secondary concept is only in these two nodes, either personas. So keep in mind, I can make administration primary, I can make administration secondary, I can make monitoring primary, I can make monitoring secondary, but there is no such concept policy service node to make them primary or secondary. So role can only be applied to these two personas, which we discussed, 4 personas. So in these two persona, you can make a device primary and you can make a new device secondary, and it can be a standalone. Standalone play all role. Role here means, not role, means the services. I would say because now it's confusing. Persona, services and role. Role is basically device role, which role they are playing. Is a standalone device, is a primary or secondary? So now we know what is role. Now node type. Node type means there are 4 node type. One of them is if a node is running policy service persona, then we call them policy service node. If a Cisco ISE node is running MNT persona, then we call them monitoring and troubleshooting node. And if a Cisco ISE node is running administration persona, we call them administration node. And if a device or a Cisco ISE node is running PX grid persona, we call them PX grid node. These are the 4 different node type: administration persona PAN, policy service persona PSN, monitoring persona MNT, PX grid persona PX grid. Either policy administration node, policy service node, monitoring node, and PX grid node. These are the node type, and which is nothing but these: administration, monitoring, policy service, and PX grid. These are personas as well, and these are node type as well. So don't confuse yourself. So MNT, PAN, PSN, and PX grid. So these were some of the terminology you need to know, that what is node type. This depends on the persona that the node is running. So which persona is running by node, we call them node type. Then we discuss role. It can be standalone, it can be primary, it can be secondary. This which type of role this device play. It's a standalone device, it's a primary or secondary. But primary secondary only applies to administration and monitoring node, not the PSN. That's the only thing you need to remember here. Then we discuss services. So these are feature which provide by persona. And then we discuss 4 type of persona, which we will discuss in detail. This is just a terminology. Then we discuss what is node. It can be a physical or virtual, which running Cisco ISE. And then we discuss local, when you create inside your Cisco ISE, username and password, either any other details. And we discuss identity store. It can be internal, it can be external, and then we say what is identity.